There's a fascinating historical relationship between Marvel's Captain Marvel and DC's Shazam. Now, for one thing, Captain Marvel's original name wasn't Captain Marvel, and Shazam's original name was Captain Marvel. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the history of the Captain Marvels. It all begins in 1939. Superman has just been introduced by the company that'll become DC Comics, and he's a cultural phenomenon. He's also being ripped off left and right by other publishers. Who amongst us can forget Skyman or Captain Freedom, The Flame, Stardust the Super Wizard, or of course Gary Concord, the Ultraman. But nobody would rip Superman off better than Fawcett Comics. Now in Whiz Comics #2, writer Bill Parker and artist C.C. Beck introduced a character named Captain Marvel, who's nothing like Superman other than looking just like him and having the same powers. Okay, well, not exactly like Superman. Cap's face was actually modeled off of actor Fred McMurray. But there were other key differences, and they appealed to the young readership. Captain Marvel is actually a 12-year-old orphan named Billy Batson. Billy is led by a stranger into an underground subway station where the wizard Shazam grants him powers. Anytime Billy screams the wizard's name, Shazam, lightning strikes and transforms him into Captain Marvel. Pretty soon, Captain Marvel has a giant supporting cast that includes Captain Marvel Jr., Mary Marvel, This Old Man, an anthropomorphic tiger named Talkie Tawny, and a bunny. The Marvel family quickly becomes a huge deal. The art was top of the line, the stories were fun, weird, super imaginative. They're also popular. There was a Captain Marvel film serial, a radio show, merchandise. Elvis was even said to have borrowed his look from Captain Marvel Jr. Most importantly, however, Captain Marvel's comics, not Superman's, were the most popular of the 1940s. And Superman was ticked. In 1941, DC Comics sued Fawcett Comics for copyright infringement, pointing out that there were more than a few similarities between the characters. The two companies battled in court for more than 10 years, and in 1953, with superhero comics at a low point in popularity, Fawcett gave in. They settled with DC for $400,000 and a promise to never publish Captain Marvel ever again. And because comic books never bring old characters back, he was never, ever to be seen again. In the early 1960s, Marvel Comics led the charge in a comic book renaissance. Around 1968, some savvy editor noticed that, hey, nobody's actually using the trademark on Captain Marvel. So they introduced a character named Mar-Vell, Captain Marvel. He's an emissary to Earth of the Kree alien race. Who are the Kree? Don't worry about it. Just know that Captain Marvel hates Skrulls and he hates Thanos. He's got super strength, he's got super speed, he can fly, he can absorb solar energy and project it out. And in a nod to the original Captain Marvel, he wields these things called negabands that allow him to switch places with a kid named Rick Jones, who's basically the Forrest Gump of the Marvel Universe. This Captain Marvel was pretty powerful and built a cult following, especially when he was handled by a writer and artist named Jim Starlin. But overall, he just never really caught on. After a bunch of revamps in the 1970s, he was diagnosed with cancer, and in 1982, he died. And there was never, ever to be another Captain Marvel published in Marvel Comics ever again. Well, except if Marvel stopped publishing comic books called Captain Marvel, they'd lose the trademark. So months later, Captain Marvel #2 was introduced, Monica Rambeau, a police lieutenant from New Orleans. Then there's Captain Marvel #3, Janice Vell, the son of the original. Captain Marvel #4, Phyla Vell, the sort of sister of #3. Captain Marvel #5, a Skrull duplicate of the original named Knur. Captain Marvel #6, another Kree named Novar. He doesn't really count. These versions of the character, they had their fans, but Marvel just never really seemed to find the right character to be Captain Marvel, until they realized the answer was right in front of them the whole time. In the early 1970s, DC Comics had a bright idea. They'd license the old Fawcett Comics Captain Marvel. But there was a problem. Because Marvel Comics now had the trademark on Captain Marvel, they couldn't publish a comic book called Captain Marvel. So instead, they had to go with Shazam. Except the character was still called Captain Marvel, leading to decades of confusion from people who thought he was named Shazam. Now, the Marvel family had taken a 20-year sabbatical, and the goofy tone just wasn't as popular as it had been in the 1940s. Plus, DC had a Superman who was just about to have a major motion picture. It didn't need a spare. But one thing Superman didn't have? A live-action Saturday morning show that had a sweet RV, a motorcycle, an old man, and some killer special effects. Still, the original Captain Marvel stories were held in high regard by many writers and artists, so for decades, every few years, someone would come along with a new take on the Marvel family. They were just never big hits. In 2011, DC rebooted their entire publishing line. It was called the New 52. All the books got #1 issues, and many of the characters were given tweaks to make them seem cooler by 2011 standards, meaning Superman wore armor and had a collar on his suit. It's a terrible idea. With Captain Mar-Vell, DC did the corporate equivalent of throwing up their hands and saying, hey look, everyone calls him Shazam anyway, let's just call him Shazam. So now, officially, the original Captain Mar-Vell is called Shazam! In the same 1968 comic book that introduced Captain Mar-Vell, we also meet a character named Carol Danvers. Now, what do you need to know about Carol Danvers? Well, she's a retired Air Force major, a retired chief of security for the Kennedy Space Center, a former editor of Woman magazine, a top-notch pilot, fluent in 3 languages, expert in armed and unarmed combat, and all by the age of 29. Oh, yeah, and she's single. So in 1977, something called a psyche magnetron explodes. It causes Carol's DNA to meld with Captain Mar-Vell's, giving her superpowers and a new identity, Ms. Mar-Vell. Also a truly questionable costume, which is corrected. Later, after hanging out with the X-Men, the then villainous Rogue absorbs Carol's abilities, leaving her powerless, until she acquires the powers of a white hole star and takes on the identity Binary. Later on, she gets her Ms. Mar-Vell powers back, takes the name Warbird for a while, but eventually she just goes back to being Ms. Mar-Vell. As a member of the Avengers, Carol becomes an increasingly popular and important part of the Marvel Universe. So in 2012, Marvel Comics, who may or may not have been looking ahead on their movie lineup, decided that maybe their most beloved non-mutant female character ought to get bumped up in status. So Carol became Captain Mar-Vell. Since then, she's been one of the headliners of the Marvel Universe, and now, star of a huge movie, Nick Fury's Emergency Contact, and, safe to assume, crucial to what's going to happen in Avengers Endgame. So there it is, 2 Captain Mar-Vells and decades of history behind them. If you want to find out more, head to your local comic book shop and catch up on the hundreds of back issues and trade paperbacks featuring all of these characters.